I'm Bradley Williams, the Chief Customer Officer and Vice President of Operations for Equus Workforce Solutions. Today, I'm joined by our good friend Clyde McQueen, who is, let me get this right, Clyde, the President and CEO of the Full Employment Council in Kansas City, Missouri.
Yes.
So welcome, and we're glad that you're with us
Thank you.
today.
Thank you for having me.
Clyde, it's great. Glad to see you show up here today to be back in person at the conference and really getting some face time with all of our colleagues around workforce issues.
This is my first in-person event in the whole 18 months.
Oh my gosh, it's mine too, and I love it.
So
I'm eating
that's
up
right.
every
That's
minute
right.
of it.
That's right.
I'd love you to share just a little bit with us to kick it off on how 2020 has went, not only for your communities, but your local area, your employers, and even your staff.
Well, first of all, when they were having the COVID shutdown in March, I had to shut down before everybody else in our region because I had a case actually in one of my career centers.
Oh, wow.
And so we had to shut down in 5 days. I had to go completely digital. I had to go from a face-to-face model. I had to buy equipment. We had to buy everybody a laptop, buy everybody cell phones, and say, effective a week from Monday, we will go completely virtual. And it was one of the most challenging experiences I had in my professional life, particularly when I had to procure computers. And so I had to go to the used computer market.
Wow.
When we had to install those things, but more importantly, how to come up with a configuration for our staff.
Right.
And there were people who were obviously very scared, is a good word for it.
Right.
That's the one other thing I've learned to do also, is that you call it like it is, not call it like what's appropriate at sometimes.
Right.
Because I think that when we are adequately descriptive, I think it lets people know that you're really being sincere about your projections and what you see, particularly as workforce leaders. And that was one thing that I found, is that a lot of the press would come to us because we were willing to talk about it.
Right.
Without trying to figure out how it came off. Now, we were still responsible, but we were able to really tell people what was happening. And so we also did not allow presumptions to occur. And there was a tend to generalize a lot. You know, for example, people don't want to work, or people don't want to do Y, Z. I said, there may be some, but that's not the majority.
Right.
Here are the circumstances here, but let me give you examples otherwise. And so we had to really take the time to detail the actual landscape of what it was, because we service rural, urban, and suburban communities. And so, you know, you just couldn't generalize. And I think that was the one thing that we tried to make sure didn't happen, because I think from an equity standpoint, and those are things that look at, we have to make sure that people look at things from an individual basis and not make these broad generalizations based upon reality as they know it. And see, I have 5 counties, 2,700 square miles, almost 1.1 million people.
A lot.
You cannot generalize across that entire populace where you have counties as small as 20,000, a city as large as 500,000, another city is 150,000, and say that everything here is operating in the same vein, that all the economic circumstances are the same, that every point from getting from point A to point B is the same. And that was one thing that we took a lot of time to detail. And because of that, we were able to have a lot of, I think, clarifying language about what the circumstance really was. Because we had people who didn't even come from our community say what was happening in our community.
Right.
And I think that was very important for to identify what the challenge truly was, what good solutions are, but more importantly, to say you just can't make a generalization about one and it applies to everyone else.
Well, it sounds like you not only went digital in 5 days, that you're very nimble, you're very flexible, that you guys were successful in that, and then figuring out how to customize solutions to each individual area.
Yes, most definitely.
So hats off to you. I think that is that's great, and it just proves that how resilient you and your team are. So I'm sure that there were different challenges that are being faced across all of those counties and communities, like you're saying, for the different constituencies. What are some of the strategies that you learned or that you put in place or that you executed on to make sure that you could meet the needs of those
Well, we had to have a multifaceted strategy. As an example, everybody said we will all go virtual, so we would all do virtual online training. Well, that was an assumption. You could go virtual in some things, but not necessarily all
of it. Right.
And even when you went virtual, there was no guarantee that a rural neighborhood or an urban neighborhood had the infrastructure, IT infrastructure, had the network to even take rural training.
Right.
Or urban training, because there wasn't strong enough network in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Or we assumed that many schools had the ability to do that. So, and that was also a false assumption. So we would identify those circumstances, like for example, we had obviously IT companies, cybersecurity was a big one. We had some instances limited healthcare offerings that were not clinically based, and then one of the largest demands that we had was truck driving.
Really?
And it was not virtual, it was real in person. We just had to be sure that the appropriate protocols were followed
In place
and
too.
we had to work with them because they'd never seen such a tremendous drive
Right.
enrollment. So they had also had challenges with it being overpowering. So yes, we had virtual, but it wasn't the magic solution.
Right.
Yes, we had in person, but it wasn't the magic. We had to come up with individual solutions, and we had to know when to hold them in place, and then when we had to go to something different.
Yeah.
So I would say there was no magic formula. We had to have what I call a 5-point approach to looking at our strategies.
Okay. So you mentioned the digital piece, like that, and we're hearing that nationwide that it didn't exactly work or meet the needs of so many people because of certain factors. So let's shift and talk about that a little bit. I think that the digital divide and the strive for digital equity is something that's a hot conversation everywhere to make sure people can have access. What has your system done to reduce the digital divide and to strive more for that digital equity as a result of finding these things out through 2020?
Well, first off, as you know, some places would buy laptops or desktops and
Sure.
then lend them to people. Well, that does not solve the problem. So we built the desktops into tuition payments so that people could then take those things home and that could be part of the family infrastructure.
That's excellent.
And
Because that helps the full household.
it helps a full household.
That's right.
You're paying your bills digitally anyway. People are working that way. So we made sure that we created the infrastructure, and it was built into the tuition payment for those persons taking online training. That's number one.
Yeah.
Number two is we also knew that there were signal boosters that people would have, and people would say, okay, but we found out those were only good for a certain period of time. So we worked with some local providers to also look at online, actually hardline digital applications that they could come up, and some of them used some of the COVID resources that were allocated to create opportunities to install hardline
Absolutely.
computers into homes or apartments as a way to make sure that they had access. Because even with all the best laptops and virtual stuff, some neighborhoods would not still wouldn't work.
That's right.
Even with the best boosters. So again, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all type of approach.
I have kind of an off question to that, thinking about individuals working in a digital setting in the household, and it was so quick that so many systems said, let us teach you possibly how to be this virtual employee should you find a job with an employer. But I'm curious if what you saw is similar to things that we saw, that so many employers didn't know if they were lucky enough to have the type of business where they could move to virtual, how to hire, recruit, hire, and retain staff to become a virtual employer. So did you see any of that, and how did your system work?
Yes, I think we did, but it was on very select bases. And the one thing, again, that I would emphasize is that there was no one magic bullet.
Right.
You had to have a whole case of options.
Got to tailor it to the needs.
Tailor to the needs. And then you had to recognize that people had different circumstances. And if the one thing we learned is that there was no one magic bullet.
Right.
There was no one magic virtual training. There was no one magic occupation that we could train for. So we were always, number one, we had also a constant interface with our population and the people that we work with and do that. Also, I learned a lot from my counterparts. For example, I learned from in Milwaukee, they had drive-through job fairs.
Yep.
People loved those, not just for the jobs, but also to get information.
Right.
So we started doing them in our parking lots, and that was a great way to recruit people and also to get information to them, not just about workforce training, but all the other options available to them, such as housing.
All the community resources that people needed.
I can tell you that was a big challenge because, career was an important part of it, but so was the fact that I got my car repossessed, and what can I do? Right. The fact that I don't have my credit cards anymore, but what can I do? Right. And so all those things had to be a part that made them come back. Right. And our whole thing is, we have to have repetition for a career to be completed, for training to be completed, for a job to be retained. Right. And so that was what we knew we had to do.
That's excellent. I love it. So a couple of interesting things have happened, not just in your state, but nationwide. One of them was, I think, 12 days ago, your state ended the emergency or the extra payment of the unemployment benefits.
Yes.
What are you seeing that so many of us that are right there or getting ready to see this? So what are you seeing as far as the impact of your
one
system?
thing that we knew is that it was going to end eventually.
Right?
And so the one thing that we have seen now is more people coming into the office, but they are asking a different set of questions.
Really?
The
What are
questions that they are asking are, how much does this job pay
they?
at the beginning? What is the rate at which I can get a wage increase? What are the fringe benefits? And more importantly, what are the shift times?
Mm-hmm.
And now they're also asking us, what child care facilities do you know?
Right.
Will they give us credit because I don't get paid to get my first paycheck? And how do I get beyond that? So I say from a client standpoint, they're not asking about, oh, I want a job. Obviously they want that, but I need to know what the shift times are, what the career progression is, because they know now exactly what it's like to not have any income coming in, but more importantly, to lose access to all other income, because many of them are in intergenerational households.
Right.
And so not only were they impacted, but their whole family
Was impacted. Yeah.
was impacted. And so they are all trying to figure out, how do I keep money in the bank? How can I prepare for an emergency? And if that's one thing COVID taught people, you better have some type of reserve account to help you deal with what's happened, because they said, we know we got the stimulus now, but we don't think we'll have it when it happens again.
It's like putting a puzzle together, but that puzzle is so important because, I mean, it is your life.
And I think that's real important. Again, we just tried to stop saying that this was a one size fits all. So we always had at least 5 things in the box that we could come at somebody with.
So you talk about intergenerational households, and COVID for BIPOC populations. Not only COVID, but the social movement over the past 12 plus months has really been taking place. I'm curious from your perspective and your organization. A lot of light has been brought to real challenges with certain communities that we need to be responsive to as a workforce system. What are you and your organization doing from a leadership perspective to tackle and advance some of these issues to make sure that we're dealing with the racial inequities that are going on in the community and in the workplace?
Well, 3 things. First off is that when people were saying, I don't know why these folks are coming to work or they're not coming to work every day.
Right.
They either had an older person in their household who was highly susceptible that they didn't want to jeopardize them. So even when our summer youth in our youth employment work-based learning programs, some of the parents, when they would hear that there was an outbreak, particularly there was one like, 3 counties away from us, they tell them to come home, not go out, because they were scared they might get infected.
Right.
And so there was concerns that just impacted more than that one person. And that's something that people didn't understand. Why are they doing this? They got a job, they got a chance to earn money. Yeah, they got somebody in their household that's 85 years old, somebody else is 93, and they don't want to get them sick.
Right.
That's so we had to be aware of that. But also we had conversations, and I think it was good. The Chamber of Commerce, they had a whole equity thing about how can we be more equitable in working with small business. That quite frankly, 80% of all jobs are from small business.
That's right.
It's not the larger companies, it's the smaller ones. And the one thing that we said was, let's don't have the same conversations I had 20 years ago. Because here we are 20 years and we still talk about the same thing.
That's right.
So what's the proof of concept that we want to demonstrate this time? And that was one thing with the PPE, when a lot of minorities, small businesses weren't getting PPE.
Right.
That was because it said you had to make a profit
to
be able to get those loans. But they changed that in the regulation.
Right.
A lot of people didn't know that, and so they didn't even come back at it. So we had to make sure that we put a community organization that could relate. So community organizations that were led by persons of color, whether they were women, men, or even females, to work with them to look at, see how they could secure that type of financing again. Because in their minds, why go after this? Because I wouldn't qualify anyway.
Right.
So you had the hesitancy based upon the same, what I call system-based presumptions that do exclude people.
Right.
And I would say.
And oftentimes, if that system fails you once, you never turn back to it,
You never turn back to it, and
Right.
you go do what you're going to do anyway. So why do it? Because it's the same old same old gravy warmed over.
Right.
And that's a big issue when you're trying to deal with systemic inequity, because those presumptions are generational, and they all assume that one person doesn't work, who's out of work, they all don't want to work.
Right.
Somebody doesn't want to do this, they all don't. And that was the one thing that we kind of stood up, and me, frankly, because I didn't mind having those interviews and telling people in a more approachable way that, listen, you can't assume that these women are more out of work because they don't want to work. Now, they got the kids.
Right.
Neither can you presume that men don't care about childcare, because some of them got kids too.
That's right.
As a single head of household. So you couldn't make any base assumptions, which I think is why now childcare is such a huge issue, because that was elevated through this pandemic.
Right.
The whole issue about digital access was elevated through this pandemic.
That's right.
The whole issue about housing support was elevated through this pandemic. So it was a very devastating circumstance. I knew people, friends of mine, people used to work with me, that died from it.
Right.
And that's just not something that you can say happened to those people. It happened to all people. And I think from that aspect, it did ask people. Now, some people still say the same thing, but there was a significant number of people who said, you know what, we do have to do something different.
Right.
And I think that was important in this. And what you talk about workforce, which meant now it's just not just about training. It's also about training that's minimal in cost. It's also about training at the right time. It's also about training in concert with child care for those who are single heads of household. It's also about where training is located,
Right.
getting to and from there. And it's also about the whole issue of transportation, of getting to and from training, to and from the child care place, and to and from work. So those are the things that we now talk about
Right.
in concert with workforce development. It is no longer a one-dimensional approach.
Right. It's not a program. It is.
It's not
It must
is a
encompass
system.
all of that in order for it
And
to work.
the system has to, and your strategies have to be demonstrated by proof of concept. We actually have people. So now we have people that said, we have some persons who were hearing impaired. Listen, this is what helped me. We have other persons who are doing that. So I think that's a real important part of it.
Let me flip it. We're talking about the individuals and communities. There's a lot of talk too now about what's incumbent on us as a system, the responsibility as a system to make sure that there are quality jobs out there, and really educating employers too on how they have to shift as a result of this to make sure there are competitive wages, et cetera. What are you seeing in your market, or what are you all doing?
Oh,
for the
I
leadership?
got people increasing wages $2 an hour.
Yeah,
I've got processing plants increasing wages $2 an hour.
that is excellent.
And at the same time, let's take the restaurant industry.
Uh-huh.
And they talk about some people. Restaurant industries have two sets of people: the core group and the transitional group. You're always going to have transitional people in the restaurant industry.
Right.
But they now recognize that core group of people has to be taken care of. And so they're looking at career incumbent worker training for those folks. How can we develop that group? And recognize that even the transitional group, you got to be making them, they got to be willing to choose you.
Right.
And so they're looking at that also. And I think that what people need to understand is that now people understand what a living wage means. What if you work, are you upside down or are you right side up? And if you're upside down, they're not going to venture out.
Right.
And I think that's just like anybody's making a decision. People are asking many more questions now about, is this the right decision, and am I going to be successful? The other thing, nobody wants to keep failing either.
Right.
And I think that that's something that becomes evident through this. And now they know the questions to ask.
Right.
And I even had chefs. Came to my people. People come to my office, and the press come out. You used to run away from them. They don't run away from them anymore.
Right.
They're willing to talk to them about, why, and they got their kids with them. That's the other thing. They got their children with them. We used to say, hey, can you put your child? No, bring your family because we know you're going to need.
That's right.
So we're going to recognize that there's support infrastructure isn't there, but they say, listen, this is a major priority and it's got to fit with this. I just can't do things in isolation anymore.
Right.
And a lot of people are doing that. And as a system, we got to communicate that to our boards and to our elected officials because they determine policy.
Right.
And that's the way you fix this, not by another program. We have to look at it from a system standpoint, whether it's the Pell Grant policy, whether it's a child care policy,
Right.
whether it's child care wages that we pay to those persons, we have to be more systematic in how we approach these, as opposed to saying, I need a program that's going to last, 24 months, and then I got to figure out how to start all over again. No, we need to say, this is how this works, do good results on it, and use it as a way to change policy to make it more universal.
Well, I'm glad that your employers are listening, because the community members are being vocal.
And they are
about
listening, but you can't be scared either. You can't be apprehensive. And so I had friends of mine, when the press came and talked to me, they said, Clyde, you shouldn't really talk about that, man. You can't win.
But it's also the right thing to do.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. We have to, sometimes we got to be a little, I wouldn't say it's risky, because if you're saying what it is and say it's not 100%, but I've got a significant number, here's the problem, I got a significant number, then that gives us more viability, credibility as the workforce system. And we got to do more of that. I mean, I've been in this system, over 40 years. And so for me, it's not a challenge, because, and my family benefited from systems like this. But we all got to do that. That's how we make an impact through our workforce approach, is changing the policy to make it more inclusive.
So it sounds like a lot of that's happening in your region, and that's kind of, I would say, a silver lining, right?
Yeah, but
maybe not a lesson learned.
Pandemic just we've been having these conversations for the whole time I've been there. It's only that they started taking attachment through the pandemic.
That's done it.
So
that's the bright side, right?
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
that there
but it
is
still
one.
was situational. But you just look at it, when Microsoft didn't become Microsoft overnight. Nothing happens, but you got to have that steady, ongoing, persistent engagement for things to change.
Right.
Even they may even be a little bit risky on occasion, but we all take calculated risk. As a workforce board member, we all do that all the time, because we're risk. Don't. If we do something safe, we'll be a safe agency. Won't change nothing. We do a little something, risk a little audit concerns. That's why we have to have very integrated funding. We do those things that can help our community, but also change the public policy that surrounds what we do.
We've got to evolve. We've got to transform. We've got to meet more needs. So where would you say, in thinking about evolution and transformation of the public system, where do you see the public system going as your region has experienced coming out of this? Lots of people are experiencing different things, but if you were to look in that crystal ball and kind of say, here's where I think the public workforce system is going over the next couple of years, what would you see? And in comparison to that, where would you say you're taking your system? Sounds like you've already laid a little bit of that groundwork.
I can tell you what, for me, when the Chamber of Commerce said child care was a major concern. Yeah. Even over TIF, even though economic development incentives.
Right.
And when they talked about using Transloc, which was a subsidiary of Ford, to come up with a heat map to identify where the transportation routes are, the child care sites are, right, and then give that to both the people who are applying for jobs as a way to increase applications, because they now know how they can get things navigated, and to the companies so that they know where they can locate future offices. That, to me, is a way that people are thinking differently.
Information is key.
Information is very key, and the fact that I don't have to always be the conversation, as long as people understand that it is a triumvirate, a multiplicity of factors that impact it. And then we have to know that for us to be effective, those things have to work with us as well.
That's right.
And so I had to learn from my child care provider that I don't call it child care, I call it early childhood development. And I got invited to the child care people, and we were talking about those type of things, right, and how we could create a career path for them. And the same thing when we started talking about transportation. And I work with the Area Transit Authority. They said we got now multi-levels of transit, paratransit, Uber transit, all these type of things that impact. And so as long as you know that the conversation, because any market has to change anyway, right? So we have to update. Just because something worked 3 years ago doesn't mean it's going to work 3 years ahead, because things change that rapidly. And so we have to be agile, mobile, flexible, and also we have to be multiplicitous in terms of the information and data that we use to inform our decision. That's the other thing. You just can't talk off the top of your head. Right. And so when you have data and statistics, which we use, and I call it left brain, right brain. Left brain is people you help, right brain is the results that you have. Right. When we talk about those two things continuously, that is a proof of concept that people understand. Right. Now nobody can just say, okay, there go that old big hard person. I like how he got it, but he gets his results are 10 cents. Or, yeah, he's got the numbers, but we talk about both things concurrently. My gosh, it sounds like you guys are making some great progress, and that there is kind of a bright side of coming out. Oh yeah, it is. I mean, really because you're engaged with it, but again, it doesn't happen overnight. you know, and that's the one thing that as long as you know that you're engaged and people come to you as a resource, then you're doing a good thing.
Do you have other words of wisdoms for all of those people watching out here before we close out today?
Well, no, I just think that we just understand that we have a very valuable role. We have proof of concept because we are on the ground. There are a lot of people that do theoretical constructs, but it's still up here. We are down here, and we should use that data and information, use pictures of who we're helping, show people the results that we have, but also show the results and the trends, both here's what works and here's what's not, and this is what we're going to do to change what's not, and we got to modify, here's what's working to keep it working. And I think if we talk in those terms, because we either tend to be on one side or the other, we do those things, I think we'll have an impact.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you about workforce development. We thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here, and thank you for being my first interview in person. And
I love it. I love it.